This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa, and today I'm bringing you a special bonus video. Innistrad Midnight Hunt preview season is well underway, and that means another limited set review is right around the corner. As usual, that means I'm doing a retrospective on my previous review, in this case the one for Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. My set reviews are always done before I actually have a chance to play with the set, as the review tends to get completed by the time the new format is on Magic Arena. As a result, I of course end up getting some things wrong about the format. And now that I've played the format a whole bunch, I can go back and look at my review and talk about what I got wrong and why, so that's what we're doing here. In this video, I'll cover 17 cards that I think I was significantly wrong about. That is, cards where I was wrong by more than half a letter grade. Alright, let's dive in, starting with a look at the white cards I got wrong. So the first white card I want to talk about is Ingenius Smith, and this is a card I actually overrated instead of underrating. Most of the time when I'm wrong in my set reviews, you can bank on me being wrong and underrating a card as opposed to overrating it, but this set's actually interesting. I overrated several cards. Usually there's like one that I overrated and several that I underrated, but this time around it's almost half and half, so that's an interesting thing about this set. Anyway, Ingenius Smith, I imagined you would have enough artifacts in like the equipment deck that you draw a card off of its Enter the Battlefield trigger reasonably often, and I thought that it would gain +1/+1 counters reasonably often, but that just isn't what happened. Part of the problem is white didn't have access to any treasure, so you sort of had to overlap with other things to get treasure. If you could consistently get treasure in white, this would have been a lot better because it would have gotten counters, but it still has the problem of usually not drawing you a card. I mean, most white decks have 2 or 3 artifacts in them, but that's just not enough to support playing a 2-mana 1/1, which will almost always just be a 2-mana 1/1. And so I gave it a C+ originally, which means, it's a pretty reasonable card, one you play a lot more often than you don't. But in reality, it's a D+. It only made the cut in very specific decks that had enough artifacts around to actually make it worth it, and that just didn't happen often enough. Next up, there's Planar Ally, another card I overrated. So, Venture, I think I overrated a little bit in general, probably coming off of Strixhaven, where Learn had been, really good, and I had underrated a lot of cards with Learn. I sort of thought Venture would be similar, but it turns out it's just not. Venturing just usually wasn't worth an entire card. In general, the Venture decks in the format didn't pan out nearly as much as the straight-up aggro decks did. And so cards that ventured, even repeatedly, like Planar Ally here, were significantly worse than I thought they'd be. And I gave this a really high grade. I gave it a B. I thought it would be one of White's best commons, but it turns out it's not really in that conversation at all. It's still a pretty good card, Planar Ally. It's one you'll play reasonably often. You just won't always play it, and, if your deck has no other venture theme, it's not amazing. It is still sort of a threat in the late game that can really snowball things for you if the game gets to that point. But I think it's a C+ in the end, and I have a hard time ever wanting to play more than one of these, except in the most venture-y decks there are. And as I mentioned, those decks on average weren't nearly as good as straight-up aggro was. Alright, next up we have Plate Armor, which is a card that I underrated. I thought this would be a pretty good piece of equipment. The stats boost and ward is really nice for the cost, even if you don't take into account the equipment payoff that it has, where it can cost less to equip. And I was right about those things, but those things were all way better than I thought they'd be. I gave this a C+, meaning, it's a pretty good uncommon, not an amazing one, certainly not one you take with a high pick, but I was just wrong there. This is one of White's best uncommons. It gets a B. This is partly because the equipment theme was so strong in the set, and there's so much good equipment in the set, and aggro decks are so good in the set. All of these things sort of combined to make a card like Plate Armor way better than it would be in a regular limited format, although I think, thinking about this card more, it's probably still like a B- in a regular limited format instead of a straight up B, so I think I would have underrated it in almost any limited format, just because it turns out that stats boost is just absolutely massive on so many board states. Alright, let's move to blue, where there's only one card I got wrong, but it's another one that I overrated. I gave it a B+, and that's Wizard's Spellbook. So I wanted this card to be good because it looks like a ton of fun, and it was. I played with it at least once, and it was fun to play with. But the problem with this card, and I said it when I reviewed it, I said if this format turns out to be really fast, this is not going to be nearly as good, and that's how things panned out. This format was pretty fast. And so a 7-mana card that's reliant on various things in your graveyard and then involves D20s, and all of this is just way too slow for the format overall. It is kind of a reasonable finisher if you end up in the rare control deck in the format that can find a way to make the game go long. It's nice that it can go after opposing players' graveyards and get their instants and sorceries. There's almost always fuel for it if you can get there. The problem was getting there. So it definitely wasn't a B+, which means almost a bomb. It was more like a C+, and that might just be a build around C+. It's really probably an F in most decks in the format, just because it's so hard to get to the later part of the game where you can win the game with this, which will take you several more turns after you get to 7 mana. Let's move to black now, where we've got Horde Robber, a card that I underrated. I gave it a D. The stat line wasn't super impressive to me, and the idea of hitting the opponent and getting a treasure token didn't seem great. I just didn't imagine it would get in very often. But if you've played this format, you've seen this a lot, because it's a common, and you know that, in fact, it gets in reasonably often. And the treasure deck, the black-red deck, really ended up being the standout archetype in the format, ended up being the best deck in the format, and Horde Robber fits in really well with that. Its ability to churn out treasure gives you fixing, it helps you ramp, helps your treasure payoffs, and it's really supported by the fact that there are a lot of creatures that just can't block Horde Robber early. This format has a lot of 2/1s, and if you play your Horde Robber on turn 2, there's a really good chance, even without any help, that the Horde Robber is going to get in and give you a treasure when you attack, especially because your opponent has to be concerned about tricks, and various, equipment that can be equipped at instant speed, the rapier that can do that. There's just so many little combos with this card. I do want to say this still isn't like an amazing card, but it's certainly not a D. A D is a card you play in desperation, and that's not what it was. Horde Robber was a solid C, especially in the black-red deck. It was kind of the 2-drop you wanted most of all. Next up, it's Reaper's Talisman, another card that I underrated. I gave it a C+. And this thing, let me tell you, ended up being a huge powerhouse. C+ is, again, pretty good piece of equipment. I thought it would be a pretty nice card to have around. Making one thing drain life is great, and giving it Death Touch means there's no way your opponent interacts with it without giving something up. And, again, all of that was true. It just ended up being even better than I expected it to be. This card really ended a lot of games. It made races impossible for people. It turned all kinds of creatures into big problems. Like putting this on Horde Robber, for example, is a complete nightmare for your opponent. And it just turns any creature into a very real threat. It gives you reach. The life gain makes it harder for your opponent to kill you. It's just very hard to beat this card, especially if it comes down early. In many games, it's just very difficult to beat. The good news is there was a lot of artifact destruction in the format, and this was one of the reasons why you kind of needed it to run it main board. There's a lot of good equipment, but this one is really the one that comes out on top, and I think it ended up being in the conversation for Black's best uncommon alongside Power Word Kill, which is a big deal because Power Word Kill basically kills anything for 2 mana, but this is really right up there with it. I don't know which I would say is better. I think I'd still take Power Word Kill over Reaper's Talisman, but it's close. All of that means this is a B+, which means it's basically almost a bomb despite being an uncommon. Let's take a look now at Sepulker Gold. This one is a little more complicated than just saying I overrated it or underrated it. I only gave it 1 grade. I gave it a C. I thought it would be a nice little 2-drop. And I did note in my set review that if you could steal your opponent's stuff, and there's a way to do it at common that we'll talk about in a little bit, this would be really, really potent. And that ended up panning out even better than I expected. Again, the black-red treasure deck, it has a sacrifice sub-theme, and Sepulker Ghoul is a big part of that. And even on the base level, even if you can't steal your opponent's stuff and sacrifice it, which is like the dream to do with Sepulker Ghoul, this is a nice little 2-mana 2/1 that's very difficult for the opponent to block in many situations in the early game. And so in the end, I think it deserves more of a build-around grade where it's a C in basically any deck. Any deck in this format you're playing, it's basically a C. But if you're in a black-red deck that really got there, that has ways to take advantage of the sacrifice effects, most especially stealing your opponent's stuff, then it moves up to a B. It's that good. It has that high of a ceiling. And, if you played this format at all, this is another common, so it's one you saw a lot. And, you can really see how this card ended up being way more powerful than I expected. Next up, there's Sphere of Annihilation, another card I overrated. I gave it a B+. So, this format doesn't have any sweepers. And so I thought this one that exists in the format, might be good, because there just aren't any of them, right? I mean, if there aren't any, that should make, it's low supply, so this card should be in high demand because there's not anything else in the format that can reshape the board like it can. And all of that's, kind of true, but making this work ended up being really hard. I tried drafting it a couple of times. I saw people play it. I never really saw it work out for anybody anytime they played it. having the right amount of mana to make the situation ideal for you is difficult. Almost everyone is playing cheap creatures, so you end up blowing up your own creatures. And the biggest problem of all is that your opponent has a whole turn to sort of know this is coming. And so during that turn, they can do all kinds of stuff that ends up making things a lot less balanced. Even though this seems symmetrical, your opponent has the advantage of knowing this is coming, and they can just attack you on their next turn however they want and not play anything. And then on their next turn, they just get to rebuild the board. One nice thing about it is that, you get to have your turn, and you do rebuild the board first, but it's still very hard to make this work, and I think in the end it was just a D, maybe even an F. Let's move now to red. First up, there's a card that I underrated, Battlecry Goblin. I gave it a pretty high grade. I gave it a B-, which means it's a good uncommon, one that you always play, and one that you can take pretty highly. But it ended up being even better than all of that. This format ended up being super aggressive, so of course a 2-drop, a 2-mana 2/2 with all kinds of upside is going to be very powerful. And it was. This format ended up having enough goblins that goblin ability really mattered, and triggering pack tactics was pretty easy. If you play it early, it's a 2-drop that really pressures your opponent, maybe adds a goblin to the board, causes them problems. But then if you draw it late, you can just use its ability as much as you want if you have a bunch of mana, and probably trigger pack tactics and have a Battlecry Goblin attacking your opponent really hard. It was just good all game long, and playing it on turn 2, if you couldn't deal with it, could often mean you were just going to lose a game. And in the end, this ended up being probably Red's best uncommon overall, a B+. It's just a very, very good card in this format, not merely, a card you first pick sometimes, but a card you first pick over most of the rares and mythic rares in the format. Next up, I have Goblin Javelin. So, we're continuing this theme of these cheap creatures were better than I expected. That's because this format ended up being as aggressive and fast as it was. A 1-mana 1/1 with haste, Raging Goblin. Not a great card overall, and I sort of looked at this and I was like, I don't think you play it most of the time unless you're in the most aggressive deck possible, so I gave it a D+. But it turns out that most aggressive deck is possible on a reasonably common basis in this format. And this little guy ended up being better than I expected, partly because there's lots of X1s that just can't block it, partly because there's a lot of X2s that can only trade with it, and then there's also ways to give it Death Touch, like the Talisman, and that makes it an absolute nightmare. Plus, it's a goblin. There's a little bit of synergy for that in the set. I still don't think it's great or anything like that, but it's a solid 1-drop for aggressive red decks in the format, and I think now it's a C. Next up, I've got Goblin Morningstar, another piece of equipment that I underrated. I gave it a C+. Again, means it's a pretty good piece of equipment, one that you'll play a lot. I liked the idea that it's basically a 2-mana 1/1 that gives you an equipment, and sometimes, a little more than half the time, it actually is a 2-mana 2/1 with trample that leaves behind equipment, is how you can sort of look at it. But equipment ended up being even better than I expected, and aggro ended up being even better than I expected, and all of that made the Morningstar a really high-quality card, not just a pretty good uncommon, but one that you first pick regularly, and I gave it a B. Next up, it's Kick in the Door. So I gave this a C. It's another card I overrated instead of underrating, and part of the reason I overrated this card, I know for sure, is because of the card Guiding Voice from Strixhaven, which was kind of a similar card. It was 1 white mana, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, and learn, okay? And I saw this and I said, maybe this has enough going on that you will pay the mana for it, and it'll give you all of these little things. You get a counter, you give a creature haste, that can't be blocked by walls part, I knew would be mostly irrelevant, and it was, but then you also venture. And I thought maybe all of that adds up to being the same thing as learning. But it just didn't turn out to be the case. And that's partly because red wasn't super into venturing in general, so this was sort of off the rest of what that color wanted to be doing. If this had been in a color like white or blue or black, and those colors really interested in venturing, it probably would have been better, but it still just wasn't great. As I mentioned, venturing just not as good as I was expecting it to be, and all of these other little effects just didn't really do anything for me. There's not really any synergy to be had here, and there's just better, you'd rather be playing Goblin Javelin than Kick in the Door. You'd rather just add to the board with a very real creature who can be equipped with all your good equipment and stuff like that than you would play something like Kick in the Door, which makes you have a creature in the first place. So it ended up being a D at least, and this is another one where, maybe it's just an F, but it just didn't do enough in this format. Next up, it's Price of Loyalty. This is the card I mentioned earlier when talking about Sepulker Gold, and again, when I was doing my set review, I realized the fact that there was a common way to steal creatures and multiple common and uncommon ways to sacrifice creatures. So I gave Price of Loyalty a build around grade, saying it would be a D in a deck that can't do that and a C in a deck that could do it. But it ended up being better in both situations. Even if you had no way to sacrifice stuff, Price of Loyalty ended up being better in the set than usual because the set was so aggressive. Stealing an opposing creature ended games way more often than you would think in this format. And so it had a base level, probably more like a C-. Like, you'll play the first copy of this in most red decks in the format, even if you don't have a way to sacrifice them. It's not amazing. A C- isn't great, and you'll cut it a lot, but it can make the cut, and it's not disastrous. Meanwhile, if you do end up in the right deck, if you look at your deck and you have a couple of ways to sacrifice things already, Price of Loyalty moves just way up in value. And it has a ceiling like as a B- and maybe even higher in a deck that really gets insane with it. But overall, it ended up being better than I expected, both as a baseline in just any red deck and in the deck that could really take advantage of it, where it ended up being really a great common. Let's move to green now. First up, we've got Direwolf Prowler, a card that I underrated. You know, I looked at this as a 3-mana 2/2 that had an ability that, sure, could make it a 4/4, but you'd have to pay mana for it. And yeah, it gets haste too, but I just didn't think it would be worth it. You know, the mana wouldn't be worth it. It would get overpowered quickly, but it turns out that it just doesn't happen that much in this format. The creatures are relatively small. This thing is a 4/4, can really stand up to a lot. It's very hard to ever block it without trading with it at least, and that made it a much better card than it looked. It also doesn't hurt that Pack Tactics ended up being even better than I expected, because the fact it can gain haste means that it can add, 4 damage, 4 power to the board immediately when you play it, and that's usually going to be enough to suddenly trigger Pack Tactics that may not have been possible before. It's still not a great card, but it's a solid common for green decks, and then, I think it's a C now. Next up, it's Find the Path, a card I overrated, giving it a C. So I saw this and I was like, man, you can just generate so much mana with this, and it ventures. Venturing is going to be really good in this format, but it turns out you don't really want to be doing either of those things in this format. I even had decks early in the format where I had like Find the Path and the 3-mana 2/3 guy who untaps your land, so I was generating all kinds of mana, doing all kinds of silly things, sort of. Part of the problem was I didn't have enough things to do with my mana, and that's the problem. This format is very, bottom heavy, where there aren't that many expensive cards that are worth ramping into, and playing a card like this that doesn't impact the board at all in most scenarios with your 3 mana isn't what you want to be doing when your opponent is curving out with a 2, 3, and 4 drop. You're probably going to lose before you ever take advantage of that mana anyway, and the venture tacked onto it just usually wasn't enough, so it was more like a D. Let's move now to multicolored. First up, it's Faraday Devil's Chosen, a card that I overrated. I gave it a B, meaning it was a great uncommon that you could first pick, despite the fact that it was multicolored, but that just didn't pan out. In general, the blue-red deck ended up not really being very functional. It's sad because die roll and venturing were like 2 of the really cool, innovative things in this set I was excited for, but neither deck really panned out as a consistently powerful one you could draft. And, you look at Faraday, and the stuff it does is incredible. I mean, it gains flying and menace anytime you roll a die, which means it can attack freely, and if you roll a 10 or higher, you get to draw a card. That's awesome, but the die roll stuff is all kind of too slow and too wonky. I mean, you end up playing some of it in the format, of course, but you don't really end up playing it in a blue-red deck unless there's one really, really good payoff for rolling die, the one that makes fairy tokens. And if you have that, then yeah, you're going to take Faraday too, but you're more after a mono blue card to make that deck work than you are a blue-red card like Faraday Devil's Chosen. And in general, this deck just didn't work, and that hurt its stock considerably. It's more like a C+, and it's kind of a build around. You kind of have to end up with enough die roll stuff for it to be worth it, and you kind of hope you don't, because some of it is pretty mediocre or worse. And the last multicolored card, and the last card we'll look at in general, is Sorcerer Class, another blue-red card, and another one that I overrated, giving it a B-, which means it's pretty powerful. It'll change games a lot of the time, and you'll first pick it on a rare but significant basis. But that just didn't turn out to be true. So my thinking was, up front, this, is faithless looting. You get to draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. That's a pretty good sort of thing to do right away. It's not amazing, but look at all the other value it gives you. But one problem with this card I really overlooked, this is sort of one where I don't think misunderstanding the format or not knowing how fast the format was going to be was what I got wrong. I just didn't really think about how many problems this card has even internally, because level 2 and level 3 are just, they're weird things to have together. The deck basically, if you have this card, the best your deck can be to use it is that you somehow have a bunch of creatures and also a bunch of instants and sorceries, and it's just very hard to do both of those things. So if you have enough creatures that can make mana to take advantage of level 2, you probably don't have any spells to play thanks to level 2. And that's a big problem. And then, I mean, I knew one thing I did get right in my set review is I didn't think level 3 would be very good, but I thought level 1 and level 2 would be enough to make this card pretty good, and then level 3 would do a thing every now and again. But it just didn't. This card's very hard to make work. It's not impossible. You know, if you end up in a deck that has a strange mix of instant sorceries and creatures, it can work, but it's just not going to most of the time. And that's why I think it's, you know, a D, a card you only play in desperation, because honestly, the fact that it can faithless looting for you does make it not an F, but it doesn't make it much better than that. So that's what I got wrong in Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms Limited. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future content, including this soon-to-come Innistrad Midnight Hunt Limited review, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you think there's anything I got wrong in this What I Got Wrong video, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.